there's this weird thing that happens in music, and it's usually by people that are kind of uneducated. And let's face it, like there's been, millions and trillions of the greatest musicians in the world who don't have any music education.
Yep.
And in fact, like many of my biggest influences are those people. But there seems to be this kind of like weird thing that we have where we need to, people that do have some sort of music education are sometimes vilified. And I think it comes from a place of insecurity sometimes. If you don't know something, then you have to somehow like resent it in some sort of way and create this world. So I think the common trope is if you know a bunch of theory, it will take away from your mojo or something like that. Like you won't be expressive, you'll sound like a robot. I don't want to learn to read because, I'll become a robot. And all the great musicians that I ever, like the really great musicians that I ever saw, they can do all of that, the nerdy stuff.
Welcome to the Vocal Lab. I'm Sarah Ramsey, and this show aims to pull back the curtain on the entertainment industry, where veterans give up-and-coming artists some of the information they wish they'd had when they were just starting out. Sort of a music industry primer, if you will. We have Rob Hamilton with us today, and Rob has always been obsessed with music and began spending hours in front of his brother's stereo, absorbing everything he could about music at the age of 4. Throughout his adolescence, Rob studied with several notable guitar masters, played well above his age category, and won many honors, including a full tuition scholarship to the famed Berklee College of Music in Boston, and was even awarded the coveted Best Berklee Entering Student Talent Scholarship for his playing. Rob then returned to Canada and completed his post-secondary education at Capilano College. After college, and now a full-time professional guitarist, Rob embarked on a career as one of the top session and touring musicians in Canada, playing for many years as a member of Canadian hard rock legend Lee Aaron's band, boy band Soul Decision, network-signed vocal group Aliqua, Vancouver Island's owned Vince Vaccaro, and the Vancouver institution Soulstream, whose reign at bar none for over a decade is one of the great pieces of history of the Vancouver music scene. Rob's extensive studio, composing, and performing experience is featured on video games such as The Simpsons Hit and Run, in which he served as session guitarist and bandleader. His composing is featured on television shows such as The L Word and The Dead Zone, with his hip-hop tune True Soul, co-written by Kia Kadiri and Scott Senft. He appeared on countless stages as a sideman with Justin Bieber, Rae Jepson, Michael Buble, and Tom Jones, among others. After playing with renowned party band Famous Players, in 2010, Rob started up his own event band, Side One, which would forever change the course of his career from hired gun guitarist to multi-million-dollar-a-year entrepreneur. As Side One expanded from Vancouver to Calgary, Toronto, and Seattle, employing hundreds of musicians and techs and doing close to 300 events a year for some of the biggest companies and events in the world. Thanks for joining us today, Rob.
Hi, Sarah.
I am so excited to have you here today. Not only are you an excellent musician and a great guy, and we go back quite a long way, but you have a whole different angle on this. And I'm so happy to be able to talk about that for our listeners. You've gone in a different direction ultimately in music than maybe you imagined as a child. And I think looking at that perspective of different pathways to success in music is a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, so. I agree. Well, I'm happy to be here. It's wonderful to see you. As you said, we go back.
We do.
Yeah.
Back to our Capilano College days. We went to school together there.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. Those were good times.
They were indeed.
Yeah, I was really fortunate actually to go to Capilano. Like some people have asked, like you did the whole thing about Berklee and stuff like that. And it was one of the questions that I often get asked by people is, you were at Berklee and then you went to Cap, it's like, it seems like a step down kind of thing. And although Berklee, I met some wonderful people. I played with some incredible musicians and made made a lot of good friends there and learned a lot. It was Capilano that actually sort of informed what would become, my career, the relationships that I made there. And instead of being, one of 700 guitar players at Berklee, I was literally number one at Capilano out of like 50 guitar players. So it was a lot more hands-on. It was a lot more playing. I was gigging. I met, musicians almost in the first couple of weeks that got me like a teaching position at a local like school and that sort of thing. So it kind of became what I really wanted it to, like my career to be, which was like a working musician. And although, some of my friends at Berklee, they went on to, write Uptown Funk and play with Prince. And I was like,
so
date Britney Spears. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should have stayed there. But no, I have no regrets.
But that piece about being, one of many fish in a big sea versus being the big fish in a smaller sea, it has its perks being the standout guy in maybe a smaller pool, and it puts you front of the line for more opportunities, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. There's sort of obviously good and bad with both of those situations. If you go to somewhere like, Side One is in Toronto, and I found it like incredibly hard to break into that market just because, there's so many people. But one thing about that is that kind of, if you want to call it an ecosystem, is that everybody's amazing. Everybody's like, every guitar player that I meet out there is like, oh my God, you're like one of the greatest guitar players I've ever heard. It's just, and it's because it is that like, there's so many people, it's this cutthroat kind of thing, or, New York. So there's advantages to, if you want to really like starve and become like a great player, there is something to that. Whereas, there's maybe not as much pressure in a smaller pool, but you will get, you may rise a little bit quicker if you can get the job done. I don't know. It's a hard balancing act, and I'm glad that I got to participate in both of those kind of worlds a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to get us started, is there anything you want to flesh out from your illustrious bio that I read about your story as a whole?
Well, I realize now that I've got to, it makes it sound like I am the millionaire from Side One. And it's like, no, all that money goes to many, many other places and warehouses and trucks and insurance. So I don't get the big part of that. But yeah, I don't know. There was you mentioned to start this off, like what I intended to be my career and what ended up being my career as two separate things, and I think that's one of the valuable things about music is that there are so many avenues to sort of go down. And I think when I was fortunate when I was a kid, whether it's luck or just sort of happenstance or however it kind of worked out, I ended up going to a high school where they had a really good, jazz program. And
literally
I didn't know it.
Right up the street from me. You went to Semiahmoo, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we had this kind of famed music teacher there. And when I was actually, at the time I came into high school, it was White Rock Junior, and Semiahmoo was a separate school altogether. And the guitar player from the White Rock Junior jazz band was graduating, and he was going into Semiahmoo. And so my sister, I was coming up to go into 8th grade at Semiahmoo or at White Rock Junior. And my sister said, listen, you're coming up, you're going to be going into high school next year. And the guitar player from the jazz band is amazing. And he's like, he gets all the girls. So if you want to be popular and get all the girls like Chris Joss, then you need to get into the jazz band next year when you come in. And it was the 10th grade jazz band, but I was going into the 8th grade. So she got me all the music, brought it home, and I took it to my teacher at the time, he was a classical guitar teacher, but we never did any sort of classical stuff. He just we mainly worked on reading, and I was actually, a pretty good guitar player by the time that I got into lessons. Like I knew a lot of the things that I wanted to do, playing Led Zeppelin songs and that sort of thing. I'd already kind of taught myself a lot of that stuff. So it was good, the things that he was giving me at the time, learning to read and learning, some theory and scales and that sort of thing. So by the time, my sister came around with this jazz band music, he said, well, I can probably get you up on this stuff. And we learned some of the chord shapes and that sort of thing. And then I went for an audition when I got into the 8th grade, and my sister sort of set up with Mr. Prosnick this audition for me, and my little brother's really good, and he wants to be in the 10th grade jazz band. He said, "Okay, we'll give him an audition." I came in, and I did pretty well at that, and I guess I kind of got the gig, and so that kind of environment that I was in was already kind of really fertile for me. There's a lot of great musicians, young musicians at the time. In that program. And then my guitar teacher had the, incredible sense, like we should all be blessed with this teacher who said, and he probably had like a million more things to teach me, but he said, listen, you're getting into this jazz stuff. There's this Yoda that lives down the street in Crescent Beach named Oliver Gannon. And I mean, this guy is literally like the top guy in the country. I don't know if he's going to take you on as a student because you're so young. And I was 12 at the time. And so, my teacher called up Oliver Gannon and said, I got this kid and I think he could be something. And, and all he said, I don't know, I don't take students that young, but let's give him one lesson and see how he does. And I studied with Oliver until I went off to college, and that forever changed my life. And that first lesson that I had with Oliver, it was very clear what I was going to do the rest of my life. I was going to become a jazz guitar player. Not only that, I was going to become, a working guitar player, which is what Oliver was. I didn't have, at the time, like I didn't have a picture of what it was going to be. Like I just thought, well, I'll get good at this guitar thing and I'll become Stevie Ray Vaughan. And but when I saw Oliver, it was like, and I came from a family who they did not want me to be, a musician at all. So, it was very business and let's go get your law degree or, like something that will actually make you some money. And then I, with Oliver, I could say, well, here's a guy that, put his kids through college and owns this house in Crescent Beach. They've got a pool and, he's done something, he's not the millionaire that I would become, No, I'm kidding. But he, I could say to my dad, I was like, look at this guy, this is what I want to do. This is because, as far as my dad knew, he's just like, oh, musicians get drunk and sleep on pool tables. And we do
which
that.
is not wrong. It's just not all we do.
Yeah. So then, that be sort of, and also, I should also mention at the time, like this was, whatever it was, 1988, and all of the guitar stuff, back then, if you were a young guitar player, you were just like bombarded with guys with long hair telling you to play a million notes a minute,
right?
And
a lot of hair metal at that point.
A lot of hair metal at that point, and that was, I was never interested in that music at all. I loved Van Halen, and that was probably the extent of it. And when I discovered jazz, I was like, this is my goth. This is my rebellion, to all of that stuff. I was introduced to Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery and Oliver Gannon, and, who, I would spend hours learning, I listened to his stuff and just lift his solos and that sort of thing. So it was really cool. And there was a lot of musicians at Samiamo at the time where we were all influencing each other. I don't even think it was necessarily, Pros gave us the kind of environment, but we were really just sort of, speaking of like, the pool and that sort of thing, you get around musicians who have the same kind of thing. I remember, a friend of mine studied with Brad Turner, and he would come in with a tape from Brad's lesson. We'd all sit around and listen to it. And then I'd come in with a tape from Ollie's lesson. We'd all sit around and like pick it apart.
That learning community is that like, that's a magical thing that you just don't get everywhere. And there were so many musicians that have come out of semi as well, like professional musicians in the pop rock field now that have initially came out of semi. I'm not going to remember who they all are. I know Dave Genn came out of semi. I know, like, there are a few of them around.
Yeah, it was, and at the time you don't think it's weird until you like see some of the other schools. You're like, oh, North Delta is obviously, or whatever. But like at the time, I didn't realize how like important and lucky this situation was going to be to my life. But yeah, it was. And I was kind of part of that, too, in creating. So that was kind of fun as well.
That aspect of community, I think, cannot be undervalued, overvalued. Which way am I going? You know what I'm trying to say. We want to really, really value that.
Yes.
So here on the Vocal Lab, the idea is to sort of shine a light into the industry through the lens of what I wish I'd known then that I know now. So with that in mind, if you were starting all over again, what would you do differently?
There's kind of technical things that, like from a guitar point of view, that I wish I'd known. Like now you can go on YouTube and you can watch Wes Montgomery play. If I would have had that when I was a kid, I would have been like, it might have changed a lot of things for me. But like I honestly, Sarah, I can't really predict, what my life would have looked like had I stayed in Boston, or had I, whatever, things may have been different. So it's hard for me to say like, change this or don't change this, but be open to whatever. I think like as we were, and maybe this will pick up where the story just left off, is I think I was convinced by the time I left high school, I'm going to move to the East Coast of the United States. I'm going to become a jazz musician. That's it. Like, here I am. And, quickly when I was down there, I mean, there was the pragmatic point of it, which is, yes, I had a full scholarship to Berklee, which paid for all my tuition. But what they don't tell you is, you've got to stay in residence until you're 21. It's one of the most expensive schools in the entire state. So even though my tuition was taken care of, it's like, it was crazy expensive for my parents to keep me there, just to live in Boston. At the time, I mean, the Canadian dollar was 50 cents to the US dollar. So,
and living in Boston ain't cheap.
No. So they sort of politely kind of went, is there some way we can get you back to Canada? And at that point, I was starting to feel a little homesick for Canada. Like anytime there was a long weekend, I would go and visit my friends up at McGill in Montreal. And so I started to think, well, maybe I'll go to McGill. And then McGill sort of said, well, we don't take people in the spring semester. So I thought, well, I'll come back home to Vancouver. I'll do one semester at Capilano, and then I'll go to Montreal in the fall, kind of thing. And when I came back to do that spring semester at Capilano, I just kind of fell in love with, Vancouver again. And I was like, there's all these great musicians here. I was studying with, Ihor Kukuruza and Bill Kuhn and Brad was up there. And there was just so many talk about up and coming musicians who are now, at that time you had, Darren Radke and Sharon Minamoto and yourself and like all these, wonderful, great, like masters of music. Even at that time, I mean, just being around somebody like Darren Radke was like, it was incredible for a young me. And so I thought, okay, yeah, maybe I can sort of like, just stay here and don't worry about this Montreal sort of thing. And that was, so I was, being open to that big change was, as I said before, like very valuable for me.
Yeah. Yeah. What year did you come to Cap?
I came in, it would have been the spring of 95. Yeah.
Okay.
I graduated in 93. So yeah, spring of 95.
Okay. So we're So you would have been in like third year? You came partway through third year?
Yeah, because I sort of I transferred from Berklee, and with music, it's not like mathematics,
No.
It's like, the first year is you learn this, and the second year you learn this, and there's this very sort of even learning the piano is sort of like this, but learning the guitar is kind of all over the place. But especially with a jazz degree, and I remember when I got to Cap, and Mike Reevely was the head of the program there, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I went to Cap," and I was like, "Oh really?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, we do exactly. It's exactly like, Berklee theory and that sort of thing." And I was like, "Oh, okay, great." So and I tested quite high. One of the things that when you get to Berklee is you take a test, and they put you into and everybody's kind of at different levels. So if you test into the Harmony 3, but you're a first year person, what they do is they put you in a class which, is other people in a similar situation. Maybe you have a good basis in theory, but we need to catch you up on the Berklee way. So they'll do, Harmony 1 and 2 in the first 2 weeks. They'll just speed you through it. And there's enough people at Berklee where you can have an entire class of first year Harmony 3 students. So when I got to Cap, and, I'd already completed all my Berklee theory. And so Mike said, "Well, yeah, this is just like Berklee, so we'll put you in." And I just about failed the Capilano theory course, even though that was my bread and butter. I loved theory. It's just, it was so, yes, it was probably Berklee theory that he was teaching, but it was 20 years old or 30 years old or something. And so I was like, I would end up getting into fights with Mike Reevely most of the class, and then eventually just not showing up.
Oh, I did a lot of not showing up to theory. I definitely had to take theory 100. I at least took it twice, if not 3 times, because there was a lot of not showing up to that class. Yeah.
And I was kind of if you remember, I was a bit of a dick back in the, I was a bit arrogant. And so, but I was arrogant even with Mike. I would be like, I've literally studied advanced modal harmony with Steve Rashinsky. He has written the book, literally written the book on advanced modal harmony. And we're in an argument right now about someday my prince will come in the passing diminished chord and stuff like that. I'm like, "Mike, you're wrong. You're wrong. This is just asshole, 19-year-old kid." So that was me.
All right. So if that's what you would do differently, what did you do right, Rob? Or is that arguing with Mike Reevely? Is that what you did right?
I don't know. I didn't know any other way. But yeah, I think. The things I did right, I guess, was, once I got kind of a plan in place, we're back in Vancouver. And as far as being the next Oliver Gannon, which is what I really wanted to be at the time, this was the sort of, 90s, and there was a lot of acid jazz kind of happening. So you could go and get gigs where you'd essentially be playing bebop, but there'd be a funky beat, when we'd be playing at the Chameleon or the Backstage Lounge or something like that. And that's where I kind of met people like, Coco Lavalcorn and Ray Garraway and Randall Stoll and I was like, okay, well, yeah, I can start getting into it. Doesn't have to all be kind of bebop, and this was kind of this is still kind of jazz in a way, and a lot of those people that I started to meet at that time, they all kind of would supplement their income in other ways. So session playing, or maybe they're playing in cover bands and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, yeah, maybe I could start doing that. And I would start to get calls for things like that, doing, playing in some cover band, doing weddings and stuff. And at the time there was also this sort of they were hiring a bunch of bands to go over to Asia.
Yes.
So did you ever play in any of those bands?
I played in those bands, but we didn't go.
Okay.
We put it together. We did all the work, and then the agent said, "No."
So that was kind of my situation. Well, in a slightly different. So there's a great guitar player in town named Joe Cruz, and Joe, actually, I'm sure you know Joe quite well, but he's wonderful.
I actually don't.
Oh, really?
Nope.
He's kind of a songwriter now, living in LA, but was kind of a piece around Vancouver for a long time, played with Sarah McLachlan eventually, and that sort of thing. Just wonderful guy. I actually met him when I was studying with Oliver. Oliver kind of put us together. He said, "Hey, here's a guy who wants to start playing jazz a little bit more." And he just lived kind of up in Delta. And so I remember in high school going over to Joe's house and us just playing tunes, but a wonderful guy. And he was in one of those bands that was over in Asia, and also with somebody that I went to high school. Speaking of semi-grad, is Kyle Radomski. And I guess Joe had met a girl over in, the Philippines when they were playing over there. And Kyle came back and said, "Listen, we've got a whole bunch of dates around Vancouver with this cover band, and Joe's still back in the Philippines. Why don't you, can you pick up some of these dates with us?" And I'm like, okay. And it was like, real top 40 kind of stuff at the time. And I never really learned any of that kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, yeah. And so I went and played with this band. We did a bunch of tours around BC. They used to book, Feldman used to book these sort of rooms, in Courtney, and you would play the Loft and in Merritt. Yeah. So I would be in college all week, and then on the weekends we would go out and play these crappy little bars in Port Hardy and the like. And I was playing cover band music. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
I do. I was playing those same rooms.
Yeah. So and in that band was Mike Henry, who's a great Vancouver vocalist. And so Mike was getting pretty sick of going overseas and playing with this band. He wanted to put his own kind of funk band together. And so he put together this little cover band called Funk Delicious with me. And we started to hire some other people around town. And that introduced me to Randall Stoll. And Randall eventually would become my boss in Soulstream. And Soulstream was just again, another kind of life-changing event for me. I was, I would go and see Soulstream when I was in college, and it was the top session musicians in town. And I was like, whoa, these guys are, this is where it's at. And then eventually, I got to play in that band for whatever it was, 10 years. And again, just being open to, okay, well, maybe the downside of this is that, I never got I was still playing a little bit of jazz, but I started to become known as the cover band kind of guy, and started to get phone calls for that, and less phone calls for, the Alma Street Cafe and that sort of thing. So while my heart was still in jazz and to a certain degree, I was still Soulstream was really just a bunch of jazz musicians, just playing funk. So there was still an element to that, but it was the smartest funk band ever.
Right. Musically smartest funk band ever.
Yeah. It was something else. It was a very special thing. So I was very fortunate to be a part of that. And there was so many sort of offshoot things. Now I was sort of recognized, I started getting those calls for, doing touring and sessions and that sort of thing. So that was all I guess, as you said, the advice that I would have given the young me is just be sort of open to, maybe this isn't going to be, what you planned on, but it was great for me and led to now what would be, my career.
Yeah. So we're in an industry that sees hugely different levels of music education and theory that supplements talent. Some have high levels of formal education, like yourself. Some are completely self-taught with zero theory. And so we've talked a bit about your musical education, but do you want to talk about how that has specifically impacted your work? Both as a player and as a band leader? which we'll get into the band leader stuff in a minute. But
yeah, that's such a great question. And it's a question I've never been really asked before, because there's this weird thing that happens in music, and it's usually by people that are kind of uneducated. And let's face it, like there's been, millions and trillions of the greatest musicians in the world who don't have any music education.
Yep.
And in fact, like many of my biggest influences are those people. But there seems to be this kind of like weird thing that we have where we need to, people that do have some sort of music education are sometimes vilified. And I think it comes from a place of insecurity sometimes. If you don't know something, then you have to somehow like resent it in some sort of way and create this world. So I think the common trope is if you know a bunch of theory, it will take away from your mojo or something like that. Like you won't be expressive, you'll sound like a robot. I don't want to learn to read because, I'll become a robot. And all the great musicians that I ever, like the really great musicians that I ever saw, they can do all of that, the nerdy stuff, like playing with Randall. I remember doing a session with him and somebody just plopping, a drum chart in front of him. And if you've ever seen a drum chart, I mean, it looks like, a fly took a shit on it. It's like, it's just like, like I thought reading guitar music is difficult. And not only was he just sight reading this, it was just like to a click, powerful groove. And these fills he's throwing down are just like, as happening as they could ever kind of. Yeah. And I just went, that's the real level. And then, when I was at Berklee, it was the same thing. I was thrown into these kind of reading labs with other guitar players. And the old joke is, how do you get a guitar player to shut up? You put a piece of music in front of them, right? And here's a bunch of like the world's greatest guitar players, and they're all just like sight reading this stuff, and they can really play, like really, really. They all play like Jeff Beck, and they can read, And it's like, well, no one's going to tell these guys they're not playing with mojo or with some sort of emotion. So I think like all of that sort of bad rap that getting to know your instrument and knowing theory has all just comes from the people that are super resentful about not knowing that. Because if you take the really great guys, it's they all know their shit and can make you cry at the same time.
Yep.
So that's the thing that I've always like wanted to be. Like that, having that kind of level of understanding and being able to, do the thing that we all want to do is move people with our playing.
If you did not have the ability to read and write music, you would probably not have been able to step into that role as a band leader and do what you ultimately did with Side One, because you guys work with charts in that band, so that you can hire in the way that you do, right? So all of that has involved the capability of reading music, yes?
Well, yes, I think there is, and I'm going to, I'll address the Side One specifically in a second, but I think like in my career, the opportunities that I've been given sometimes don't require that, and sometimes they do. So like I was musical director for a production of American Idiot, the Green Day musical a few years ago, or Rent. I've done Rent as well. And I think like, and I played musicals since I was in college, as a part of like, just as a player trying to get income and that sort of thing. Yeah. So you need to be able to read in that kind of world. Now with Side One specifically, there are many musicians in our camp that don't read, don't know theory, any of this stuff. So I need to be able to speak a whole bunch of languages.
Yeah.
With our horn players, I've done all of the charts. Well, I did all the charts when we started the band, mainly because I just needed to save money. But the wonderful thing is with like a horn player, I can hire horn players. Like we've done gigs in California and we've done gigs in, Miami or something like that. I don't need to fly one of my Vancouver musicians down that has done the gig a bunch of times, I can hire local guys because we have these charts and they just come in, they read them down perfectly.
Yep.
And so having the ability to write that, well, first of all, that saved me a whole bunch of money. I don't need to hire, an arranger to do that for me. And plus, it's a nice little creative outlet. Like there's a lot of songs that we do with side one that don't have horns on them. And so I'll like create a horn part. And like there's been people like in the band that'll be like, now when I hear that song, like I hear your horn part that you wrote there. I was like, that's right. That's about a little, as far as being creative within a cover band, let's face it, Sarah, like I don't have a lot of opportunities. So I take it when I can get it. And so that's a little kind of, a nice little perk of that. And to speak the language, we don't rehearse with the band, like I think, with our Vancouver team, we had 2 rehearsals, 10 years ago where we just ran set 1 in the first rehearsal and we ran set 2. And then since then, we've never, ever rehearsed. Yeah. And the way that and there's people in the band that don't read music. They don't have to read music. As long as they can transcribe the stuff on their own, that's fine. But there's a language that I can speak to those that do and those that don't, that, we can say, like when we have to talk about, certain chords and that sort of thing, like it's very easy to do. But the way that I've structured it, I've sort of embraced the fact that we have musicians coming from all over, the musical spectrum. That's one of the wonderful things about the band. But like to sort of push back, like inside one, yes, we have charts sometimes. I've also found that to be not such a good thing. Like there's people that I purposely made the kind of what I call the master charts kind of a little bit vague. So people do have to dig in and do the work. Like, there's one thing to play, not that we play the song, but I always use it as an example. It's like, Brown Eyed Girl is G, C, and D, right? But if you listen to Brown Eyed Girl and you listen to the guitar part, it's actually kind of an elaborate. And if I'm just a session player sitting down and I haven't really listened to the song and I'm just playing G, C, and D, you're not going to last very long in side one. I want people to do the work. So when we get on stage and it's the first time and I hear a keyboard player and I was like, oh, they haven't checked out this shit, They don't know what they're doing. They're just reading my super vague chart. So I've had this love-hate relationship with our charts in the band where it's like, it can create some laziness. Like people can just rely on that and just kind of get through the gig. And those aren't the people that I want to hire. They don't last very long.
Yeah. I think that's a really important distinction to make. I think too, when you're talking about the languages of music, there's sort of 3 different ones. There's the ones where people just straight up know their theory and read, and you can talk about GCD and whatever the half diminished chord and the blah, 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 all that stuff. There's the people who don't know what any of that means. So they know all the things, they know none of the things. And then there's a middle ground where they don't necessarily know. You can't put a chart in front of them and they can read it, but they can speak numbers. And when I talk to students, who don't necessarily read, I talk a lot about the importance of having that skill, because if you don't want to put the time in and learn to read, at least know that you can talk about. It doesn't matter what key the song is in. You can talk about the 1 chord and the 4 chord and the 6 chord. And then it doesn't matter if you've got a horn player and a guitar player and they're, potentially playing in different keys. It's the same thing if you're talking in numbers. And it's a more like universal language, whether you know all your bits and pieces or not.
I like that too, even not necessarily just the chord stuff, but the actual note stuff. So when we're working out like background vocals or something like that, then I can say, to Patrick, oh no, you start on the 3rd or you start on the 5th kind of thing. And then becomes like, you can rely on that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So I think that language of numbers is incredibly useful in talking about music. And it's a really good middle ground for different levels of learned knowledge. So what have been, and I mean, you can name whatever names you want, but I'm actually asking less for names and more about just the actual relationships. What have been the important relationships in your career that have moved you forward, that have helped you get where you wanted to go?
Well, certainly, as I've mentioned, like Semiamu, like the high school environment that I was in, and all of the wonderful students, pros for just sort of creating that environment. My first guitar teacher, who introduced me to Ollie and had the great sense to just sort of like give up a great student.
Yeah.
It's a hard sacrifice to do. Because it's the right thing to do, and then of course Ollie, all of the relationships I even made at Berklee. I still, my buddy will come to town who plays with Paul Simon, and we'll go out for a drink or whatever, and it's interesting to just hear that world. I don't know a lot of like that world, like on that kind of level, and the struggles. Even for musicians on that level who are playing with some of the world's best. Very interesting. And kind of like, it also makes me reflect on the choices that I've made in my life, doing what I'm doing. And then, I think like every musician that you meet in, like, if you are starting to take this path of like, you're going to become a professional musician, you're going to try to make your living off your instrument. And I remember when I was in college, my dad, starting to hedge his bets a little bit and just going like, okay, I'm not going to talk this kid out of being a musician. Like maybe he gets his education degree kind of thing. And I was so like headstrong that I wanted to, like, I felt like if I had something to fall back on, that I would fall back. So I got my performance degree, which was kind of ballsy. And at the time at Cap, you probably remember, there wasn't a lot of like performance majors at the time. Like everybody was starting to go into the education stream. I think there was like, when I graduated, there was only like 3 or 4 of us. And so, but I was really like sort of hell bent on using the guitar to make a living. And when you do that, I guess this is the same in sort of any thing, but especially if you are like a contractor, you are your own business, really. So like,
yes,
like as this person going out into the world, like people are going to talk shit about you if you're a dick, if you mistreat people, if you can't get the job done, if you sleep in, if you're like, I wasn't always like, I don't consider myself the most talented guitar player, but I could outwork anybody. Like that was always my gift. I would always show up at the gig on time. I always knew my stuff. Like, and I was just reliable. Like people would know, like, even if it was like 2 days to the gig, I would be able, like, I would stay up all night learning all of the material, even if the gig paid $60, because I just wanted to always be known as that guy. So every kind of interaction that you have with other musicians or people in the field, like, know that is, going down on this permanent record, of like who you are. And that was like, I think I learned that pretty quickly.
I think that's a perspective that actually doesn't get addressed often enough. And that is that as a performing musician, what you are is a business. Like what you are doing is running a business. And I don't think that very many people understand that perspective. And I don't mean to take anything away from the art of performance. It's not that. It's the and also part of it, that you actually have to understand a lot more of the back end pieces of it, because as a performer, you are you are a business.
Yeah.
And there's more to it than just sounding pretty.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I'm thankful. Like usually there is a kind of, continuum of like talent and just sort of flakiness, where you'll have like super talented people that would just be like, really, really flaky. And because they can, right? Like they know they've got this gift from God, and they're going to continue to get hired. I think you and I both know probably about half a dozen or a dozen people in this town where, you know, it doesn't really matter how they behave. People are still going to hire them because it's such a valuable commodity that they have. But that only lasts for so long.
Yeah.
You know, and when I started my band, I sacrificed people that are that talented, but I just wouldn't hire them just because I knew I couldn't count on them.
Yeah.
You know, to show up and learn the material, be on time, all of this kind of thing. So I'm fortunate that, you know, I'm now in a place of prestige where I get both. Like, you know, all of my musicians and singers are all incredibly, you know, I mean, just like it blows my mind how good the people I work with are and are that responsible. Yeah. And I even like joke with someone when I say, like, you know, you could just, you know, like you've got the talent to just go full Mariah on us, you know, like demand a certain guacamole, but you don't. And it's like, it's so refreshing.
And those are the people that you want to be with, or the people that have the chops. They've got all the stuff and like, keep it real. They're not getting.
I don't take that for granted. You know, like that it's important to make sure that everybody's needs are met and like everybody feels like, you know, with Side One, you know, one of the ways that we've been able to sustain such an incredible roster of musicians is that I've worked in projects where, and I see this a lot in like Toronto, especially, where it's like, you're not allowed to play with other bands. Like there's all of these like, there was even like when I was playing in certain bands in Vancouver, if you needed to sub, like if you got some opportunity, like some touring opportunity, but you have to play Mr. and Mrs. Smith's daughter's wedding, you know, with this band. Yeah. And it would turn into like an hour conversation, even if I had a sub or something like that, where I would have to plead and beg and essentially just bend the knee. We don't want that. Like when I put Side One together, the way that we're going to attract the most talented people is to give them the freedom to do, you know, the projects that they're very passionate about, whether that be an original project or need to go off on a tour with some like incredible artist. And it's like, don't worry about it. We'll get it covered. We'll figure it out somehow. Yeah. Like, you know, like
you don't want that unofficial non-compete.
No. Yeah. No. So, you know, like that has been, again, now that I'm on the other side of the glass and I'm hiring people and that sort of thing, like it's still that part of it where it's like, I'm my own business and I want to make sure that people want to come and work for me, you know, now, like not just be a hireable person, being, you know, like an employer that's like, you know, like, I certainly have demands and expectations of my musicians, as you know, we've already kind of heard throughout, but I also like, if you can deliver, it's going to be a good place to work.
Thanks for joining us today. That was actually just part one of our interview. And I would love it if you come on back Thursday to catch part two. Can't wait to see you then.